Thank you all for coming. Linda, thank you for having us. Thanks to the Center for Fiction. It is really fun to be here with Guernica. Thank you, Lisa and Meekin, for being partners in crime with the Common here. And I am delighted about our suite of writers who have come to join us to talk. So just a brief introduction about me and the Common. I'm Jennifer Acker. I'm the founding editor and the editor-in-chief of the Common. This is our 4th year of publication. We publish in print and online, and we publish work with a strong sense of place. And so place may come up in this conversation, but usually I'm on all these place-centric panels, so this is a little bit different. So I'll let Meekin say something about Guernica maybe, and then about how we're going to proceed tonight.
Sure. My name is Meekin Armstrong, and I'm the fiction editor at Guernica. We're online only. We come out, we do it in a variety of ways, though. We're every 2 weeks, and we've been doing that for 10 years, and every day. Also with articles and some flash fiction, and then we also have special issues, the next one being on class, and we're opening submissions, by the way, for that. And we were founded by 2 guys, one guy in the audience, when they met at an NGO in Costa Rica, and they decided to keep the international vibe going when they did a reading series in a bar called Guernica. And then that ended and it became a blog, then a site, and here we are today. And we publish quite a bit of fiction, including several of them up there. I saw about 4 or 5 of them up there, and several of people up here. So, including Jennifer. So, anyway, that's it.
Okay, great. Shall I tell you why we're gathered here today?
Yeah. And we're not about place. We're more about the interplay between cultures. Mm-hmm. So I guess it's a complementary thing. Yeah. One can lead to the other.
Yeah, right. So the idea for this panel was sort of at the intersection of readership and culture, and came out of a conversation with Lisa and thinking about the intersections of these magazines and what kind of readers we are to begin with, and how that transforms into what kind of writers we are. So the question is sort of, who do you write for, which is a way of getting at as writers and readers, especially many of us feel like we didn't grow up in the mainstream, whatever that is. So often it's very exciting if there's a piece of fiction or a piece of literature that you feel is speaking directly at you, speaking to you in some way. And that's where some of that excitement is born. So we asked 3 writers to come tonight with pieces of writing that they feel speak specifically to them for whatever reason. It doesn't have to be discovered in childhood. It could be just in this moment. And I know everyone is really excited about sharing those things. So maybe we'll briefly introduce people first. And so I would just like to introduce and welcome Ben Anastas, who is the author of 2 novels and a memoir, most recently called Too Good to Be True. And he also has the lead object essay in the fall issue of the Common, which is back there on the table. So based on that and what Ben's going to read, I know that I've been thinking about objects and thinking about childhood in some way, because you're going to read some Nabokov, right? It's a boyhood scene. So I'm interested to hear what you're reading about that. But a terrific acclaimed fiction and essays, and widely produced essays in major magazines as well. So looking forward to hearing about that, and from our other writers also.
And we have Dina Behari, who published Was it last year? It was last year, right? A Teaspoon of Earth and Sea, which is from Riverhead and Penguin, and was translated in multiple languages around the world. And she also was published in Guernica in her Flash Pen World Fiction Flash Fiction series with Pen. And she is going to be doing Never Let Me Go and Housekeeping, and somehow they're going to interplay against each other. And Kiese Lehman, who has 2 books out, and How to Slowly Kill Yourself and Others in America, and Long Division, and also 2 essays, I believe, that read in Guernica. And you're going to be reading a beautiful short story that I guess it'll be self-evident that was right.
A paragraph from
A
this.
paragraph. And we'll figure out the rest.
A paragraph from 20 K bars.
Yeah.
The lesson.
Yeah, it's an incredible story. I'll leave it at that.
Kiyosa, do you want to go first?
Oh, okay.
Let's, point that towards you, but
All right, so if you haven't read The Lesson by 20K Bombara, shame on you. For real, shame on you. But you should read it. And I'm going to read the first paragraph of the piece. All right, The Lesson. Back in the days when everyone was old and stupid or young and foolish and me and Sugar were the only ones just right, this lady moved on our block with nappy hair and proper speech and no makeup. And quite naturally we laughed at her, laughed the way we did at the junk man who went about his business like he was some big time president and his sorry ass horse his secretary. As we kind of hated her too, hated the way we did the winos who cluttered our parks and pissed on our handball walls and stink up our hallways and stairs so you couldn't halfway play hide and seek without a goddamn gas mask. Miss Moore was her name, the only woman on the block with no first name, and she was black as hell. Except for her feet, which were fish white and spooky. And she was always planning these boring ass things for us to do, us being my cousin mostly who lived on the block because we all moved north the same time into the same apartment and then spread out gradual to breathe. And our parents would yank our heads into some kind of shape and crisp up our clothes so we'd be presentable for travel with Miss Moore, who always looked like she was going to church, though she never did. Which is just one of the things the grown-ups talked about when they talked behind her back like a dog. But when she came calling with some sachet and she'd sewed up, or some gingerbread she'd made or some book, why then they'd all be too embarrassed to turn her down and we'd get handed all spruced up. She'd been to college and said it was the only right that she should take responsibility for, the young one's education, and not even related by marriage or blood. So, they go for it, especially Aunt Gretchen. She was the main gopher in the family. You got some old dumb shit, foolishness you want somebody to go for, you send for Aunt Gretchen. She's been screwed up in a go-along for so long, it's a blood-deep natural thing for her. Which is how she got saddled with me and Sugar and Junior in the first place while our mothers were in a la-ti-da apartment up the block having a good old time. That's the first paragraph of the lesson. A short story y'all should all read.
I sort of want to cancel the rest of this and do the rest of this. Yeah. Am I next?
You're gonna make them work for 2 different stories.
Okay. You sound so skeptical and nervous. Although I love the idea of this event because, you know, it's always so nerve-wracking to read your own work, and now I get Marilyn Robinson's work to read, so that's pretty amazing. But I'm going to read 2 little paragraphs. One of them is from Marilyn Robinson's Housekeeping, and the reason that I chose this is because I guess a lot of how I write and why I write is to express I guess a lot of emotions, but mostly longing. You know, I've had to restart my life again and again and again, and every single time there's this feeling of everything lost, wanting to grasp it again and find it again. So this paragraph is about that. This is from Housekeeping. Imagine a Carthage sown with salt, and all the sowers gone, and the seeds lain however long in the earth, till there rose finally in vegetable profusion leaves and trees of rime and brine. What flowering would there be in such a garden? Light would force each salt calyx to open in prisms, and to fruit heavily with bright globes of water. Peaches and grapes are little more than that. And where the world was salt, there would be greater need for slaking. For need can blossom into all the compensation that it requires. To crave and to have are like a thing in its shadow. For when does a berry break upon the tongue as sweetly as when one longs to taste it? And when is the taste refracted into so many hues and savors of ripeness and earth? And when do our senses know anything so utterly as when we lack it? And here again is a foreshadowing. The world will be made whole. For to wish for a hand on one's hair is all but to feel it. So whatever we may lose, the very craving gives it back to us again. Though we dream and hardly know it, longing like an angel fosters us, smooths our hair, and brings us wild strawberries. So this is from housekeeping, and when I read it, I remember suddenly thinking back to this book, which I had read a couple of years before, and you know, it's kind of a strange book, you were saying, instead of a really bizarre premise, which is, you know, that these people, I'm sure you've all heard about it by now, but these people are clones and their body is being harvested for organs, but that's just kind of the baseline. Beyond that, it's a beautiful story of love and growing up and losing things. And at the very end, this character goes to Norfolk because as a child, they were kind of imagined as children, all of these friends, that all the things that they had lost would end up in Norfolk, which is a place they imagined they would never be able to go. So this is the last paragraph of Never Let Me Go. I found I was standing before acres of plowed earth. There was a fence keeping me from stepping into the field with 2 lines of barbed wire. And I could see how this fence and the cluster of 3 or 4 trees above me were the only things breaking the wind for miles. All along the fence, especially along the lower line of wire, all sorts of rubbish had caught and tangled. It was like the debris you get on a seashore. The wind must have carried some of it for miles and miles before finally coming up against these trees and these 2 lines of wire. Up in the branches of the trees, too, I could see, flapping about, torn plastic sheeting and bits of old carrier bags. That was the only time as I stood there, looking at that strange rubbish, feeling the wind coming across those empty fields, that I started to imagine just a little fantasy thing. Because this was Norfolk after all, and it was only a couple of weeks since I'd lost him. I was thinking about the rubbish, the flapping plastic in the branches, the shoreline of odd stuff caught along the fencing, and I half closed my eyes and I imagined this was the spot where everything I'd ever lost since my childhood had washed up. And I was now standing here in front of it. And if I waited long enough, a tiny figure would appear on the horizon across the field and gradually get larger until I'd see it was Tommy. And he'd wave, maybe even call. The fantasy never got beyond that. I didn't let it. And though the tears rolled down my face, I wasn't sobbing or out of control. I just waited a bit, then turned back to the car to drive off to wherever it was I was supposed to be. I think the connection is obvious, right? Right? Good, okay.
I'm going to be very curious to hear what Casey and Dean have to say about audience and the pieces they're reading. Because when I heard about the kind of subject for this panel, I thought about different things to read, and then I realized, well, today is Nabokov's birthday. Maybe I should read some Vladimir Nabokov. And I had this vague memory of this very cranky. He was fond of making these very crankish statements. Of this crankish statement he made about writers and their audience, and I found it today. And this is in an interview that was collected in Strong Opinions. He said, "I don't think that an artist should bother about his audience. His best audience is the person he sees in his shaving mirror every morning. I think that the audience an artist imagines when he imagines that kind of thing is a room filled with people wearing his own mask." Which he sounds like a clone, right? I mean, he's a man with the heart of a clone. Anyway, there's lots of food for thought in there that I hope we'll discuss. But anyway, so I wanted to read a quick passage from, I think it's my favorite book by Nabokov, it's Speak Memory, his autobiography. I know this is the Center for Fiction, but he writes about his life as if it is fiction. And this comes in chapter 2. He's describing how he was often ill as a boy and how this brought he and his mother close together. And there's this giant pencil that makes an appearance, which is kind of what Jen was talking about earlier. So one day, after a long illness, as I lay in bed still very weak, I found myself basking in an unusual euphoria of lightness and repose. I knew my mother had gone to buy me the daily present that made those convalescences so delightful. What it would be this time I could not guess, but through the crystal of my strangely translucent state, I vividly visualized her driving away down Morskaya Street toward Nevsky Avenue. I distinguished the light sleigh drawn by a chestnut courser. I heard his snorting breath, the rhythmic clacking of his scrotum, and the lumps of frozen earth and snow thudding against the front of the sleigh. Before my eyes and before those of my mother loomed the hind part of the coachman in his heavily padded blue robe, and the leather-encased watch, 20 minutes past 2, strapped to the back of his belt, from under which curved the pumpkin-like folds of his huge stuffed rump. I saw my mother's seal furs, and as the icy speed increased, the muff she raised to her face, that graceful winter-ride gesture of a St. Petersburg lady. 2 corners of the voluminous spread of bearskin that covered her up to the waist were attached by loops to the 2 side knobs of the low back of her seat. And behind her, holding onto these knobs, a footman in a cockaded hat stood on his narrow support above the rear extremities of the runners. Still watching the sleigh, I saw it stop at Troyman's, writing implements, bronze baubles, playing cards. Presently, my mother came out of the shop, followed by the footman. He carried her purchase, which looked to me like a pencil. I was astonished that she did not carry so small an object herself, and this disagreeable question of dimension caused a faint renewal, fortunately very brief, of the mind dilation effect, which I hoped had gone with the fever. As she was being tucked up again in the sleigh, I watched the vapor exhaled by all, horse included. I watched, too, the familiar pouting movement she made to distend the network of her close-fitting veil drawn too tight over her face. And as I write this, the touch of reticulated tenderness that my lips used to feel when I kissed her veiled cheek comes back to me, flies back to me with a shout of joy out of the snow blue windowed, the curtains are not yet drawn past. A few minutes later, she entered my room. In her arms, she held a big parcel. It had been, in my vision, greatly reduced in size, perhaps because I subliminally corrected what logic warned me might still be the dreaded remnants of delirium's dilating world. Now the object proved to be a giant polygonal Faber pencil, 4 feet long and correspondingly thick. It had been hanging as a showpiece in the shop's window, and she presumed I had coveted it, as I coveted all things that were not quite purchasable. The shopman had been obliged to ring up an agent, Dr. Libner, as if the transaction possessed indeed some pathological import. For an awful moment, I wondered whether the point was made of real graphite. It was. And some years later, I satisfied myself by drilling a hole in the side that the lead went right through the whole length. A perfect case of art for art's sake on the part of Faber and Dr. Libner, since the pencil was far too big for use and indeed was not meant to be used. So the idea that, one of the ideas I pull out of it is just the wonderful line about this pencil being constructed so perfectly for its own sake, which is kind of not for an audience, right? It's just for the sake, for the integrity of the pencil. And I guess I've always sort of felt as a fiction writer, more than a nonfiction writer, interesting, as a fiction writer, that like the idea of an audience is something that is ultimately like not that helpful. It can be sort of limiting. If you're aware of an audience, kind of that's when you sort of freeze up. That's when that's when your pencil, your graphite doesn't go all the way through the pencil.
You know, I went to the Nabokov house in St. Petersburg, and they had his typewriter there. It was banged the hell out of it. He had that thing was just a mess. It looked like it'd been like a car, that'd been in an accident. It was attacked.
And just think of poor Vera, they were changing the ribbons, like as they were just trying to get this typewriter to still work.
Did you just have the one?
They only had that one. I don't know if he only had one, but you can only get on the ground floor. But the house that we wrote about, and it had been trashed by the revolution and all that,
Right.
so there wasn't really much left. But he did have his typewriter. Yeah. An artifact. But I don't know, would you write for Nabokov?
That, no, I could never, no, I don't think I'd ever do that. Another thing I was thinking of before this event was Virginia Woolf's essays in Moments of Being. One of them is called, I think it's called A Sketch of the Past, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And she writes about invisible presences. So this essay where she writes about sort of three vivid memories she has. One of which is is her half brother molesting her when she was a girl. But it's the idea that your writing is kind of this way to kind of summon these invisible presences you have in your life, these characters, these people who've been with you at one time and are still kind of hovering, and yet when you write about them, it's this kind of communication with them, and somehow they're your audience, even though they're not there for the most part. You kind of read what you're doing, but you're kind of talking to them. And that's an idea that's always been kind of interesting to me.
Mm-hmm. So I have a question about writing fiction with an audience in mind, but I guess I'd like to hear first about the story and your relationship to it, and why you thought to read it, and how it feeds into your own writing, if it does.
Okay, so I wanted to read the story because I think it's one of the best American short stories ever written. And primarily I wanted to read it because as a child, I read this when I was a kid. It was one of the first short stories that I felt was written to me, right? And I think this is important about the question of who do you write for and who you write to. I felt like Toni Cade Bambara was writing to me, but also felt she was writing for me. And I read a lot of stories by primarily black Southerners at the time who were writing for me, but they weren't writing to me. And I'm hopefully we can talk about that distinction, because I think it's important for particular groups of people who are categorically written out of the American narrative for all intents and purposes to see literature that is, again, written for them and to them. And what I feel an urge to do as a writer is to write for, young black girls and boys from the Deep South. And that's easy. But the hard part is writing to them. So what I think a lot of us do at our worst is we try to write from this place to this mass of whiteness that doesn't necessarily really think we're human. So it's like this native informant thing that I think goes on, that I hope we can also talk about. And there's nothing more boring and actually sad, I think, than watching particular writers, black writers from the South, try to universalize for folks who might not ever see your group of people as human. So when I read Toni Cade Bambara, I knew she was writing to me, I knew she was writing for me, and I knew that I could do what she was doing. But I knew I had to have the strength to do both. And I just think those are, again, I want to talk about the differences between writing to and writing for.
Yeah, so when you say writing for, is that sort of more didactic? It's like more sort of informational, instructional, whereas to would be more like, that's more of an experience, like
well, for me,
greater investment?
Four is just, four is it's almost like a spiritual, spatial, like everything I write, I know I'm writing for young black folk from Mississippi, right? Like I'm writing for that part of myself, that part of my grandmother, that part of my cousins, that part of some of the people in this audience. There's no question. But literally, I think the to question is a question of craft. And so if I'm writing for this group of people, depending on what the short story or the essay or the poem is, I think if I'm writing to them, there's certain things that I might not necessarily have to explain. And one of those things I might not have to explain is quote unquote their humanity, right? Because we are in a literary and a national American context where we believe that race, particularly blackness, needs to be transcended for white folk to get it. And I think if you buy into that, you can get accolades and shit, but your literature is going to be praised but whack. So I'm just saying, Tony K. Bambara was someone who was not whack, who was praised, and who I felt wrote directly to me and people who were written out of the longer American narrative.
So don't be whack, that would be like.
Well, don't be whack and don't ask black people to like be human, because we're kind of like, we are human, you know? I just don't ask us to transcend our blackness to make you feel better about your whiteness, and understand that this is what Tony K. Bambara was doing and did exceptionally well. So.
Yeah, Dina, your own, yeah.
For me, I was just thinking about what you said. I mean, it's so interesting to think, like, for example, to listen to that and think of why I write about Iran or Iranians and why I keep coming back to that. To me, I mean, I feel like it's a little bit the same thing, but I come at it from an opposite direction, because Iranians, I mean, it is a very different experience, but often Iranians have been exoticized and written about in ways that it's almost kind of the opposite. And so what I strive to do is just wipe away almost the Iranianness and to go get at things that are deeply human, you know, and so that are going to be universal in that way. So for me, you know, when I picked up housekeeping, I did it reluctantly just because, you know, I've heard so much about her. She was about to become my teacher, and I wanted to read it. But the idea of the novel, you know, a bunch of women, you know, in you know, the South. What was it called? The name of the town. Anyway, it was
Fingerbone?
Fingerbone. Yes, exactly. Which, by the way, is Marilyn Robinson's Wi-Fi name. Yeah, I discovered that when I was checking my phone near her house. It was anyway, but you know, some small town America with a bunch
That was totally going in the diary.
So we should go around my names of like the typewriters in there. What is Philip? 20 more.
I think it's like you don't want to know in some cases.
Yeah. So, but anyway, when I picked up housekeeping, I had no interest at all, you know, in these people and their experience that I couldn't at all relate, and I kind of went into it reluctantly, knowing what I would get would be beautiful language. But there were moments where it just transcends the story and goes into places that are so that pretty much make us want, you know, that are so deeply human, that we've all felt, and you know, you don't have to at all have, you know, lived anything that these people have lived. In fact, this is one of the few books where years later you don't remember any of the plot. What you remember is those passages where she just made you drop the book and say, oh God, you know, you have just put into words everything that I feel. And so for me, you know, it's about trying to reach those places and to try to forget an audience altogether. Because I know that, because I've had problems with audiences. One of those problems being that, you know, I'm an Iranian American, but also mostly American. I came here at 10 years old. I had a privileged education. Iranians don't think I have the right to write about them. And they have told me so as I've traveled around the world with Teaspoon. You know, and often they say, well, you know, why should you get to be the person who gives a voice to, you know, this village girl from the 1980s? You weren't there at that time. And it makes me, you know, it makes me think that in some ways that for them to be asking this, if they've read the book, means I haven't really done my job, because it's not about a girl in Iran at that time. It's about something that you feel, you know, growing up, or you know, losing something, or falling in love, and and I have that experience. I have the ability to you know, to show that with words, and so. So when I'm writing, I try to kind of get to this place to try to let go of all of the questions of audience, and the question of, you know, do you have the right to, and how should you be portraying these people for them? It's not about that at all. It's about, you know, what makes me be interested in her.
And it sounds like thinking about that audience would even be a little bit of a distraction or a hindrance, or would at least provoke, now that you've had these experiences, would provoke some kind of anxiety about, well, what might those people say
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I feel like I've heard other writers talk about this, and especially ones that had really big first books. They talked about how hard it was to write their second book because they were always thinking of that audience, every single person who read their first book, and it became crippling because I remember actually in a talk Elizabeth Gilbert was talking about this. She said, you know, she wrote her first book, not her first book, but she wrote Eat, Pray, Love, thinking of whispering that story in the ear of like a friend. And then she wrote the next one, which she didn't consider to be a very good book, for all the 7 million people who read the one before. And I was, as I was listening to that, I was thinking, you know, yeah, what a mistake that is to think of the audience at all. I mean, writing is a private act. It's almost a lavatorial act, you know? It's true. Like, you should be doing it alone for yourself without thinking of who's watching or who will be watching.
I didn't think I knew that was an adjective.
It is now.
Yeah.
Sure is.
I think Kiese's point about who you write to and who you write for is a good one, in the sense that you do, just by virtue of you know, being a part of a community, being a part of a family, and it could be talking about a large community or small community, you are writing about a kind of shared experience, and there's a lot of responsibility that comes with that. I think it can give you a lot of comfort as a writer to feel like, well, you know, I'm just not sort of like, my sentences aren't resting on like air here. They're you know, it comes from something, and I think so. I think who you write for is much more useful and productive than who you write to, because I think once you're worried about who you're writing to, then you're worried about kind of tuning your sentences. It's like, well, I can't get too complicated here because, you know, I'm writing for a certain kind of audience. And I think often, you know, we can often sort of misjudge what audiences kind of want to hear or are interested in hearing. And I always feel like it's publishing, it's their job is to worry about like kind of who's going to be reading this thing. It's like when it comes to writing, our job is to write these books, and then it's like, you know, let the publishers worry about what happens next. Of course, you want to help your book. You want to help your book find readers and all that. But ultimately, you know, this task is between kind of you, and you're trying to pull these sentences out of the thin air and put them on the page so they're going to mean something to people, right? But you know, if you're worried too much about kind of who's going to be sitting there on their other side and opening the book, then, you know, I think that potentially could be worrisome. Although, you know, Kiese might feel differently. Like there might be, if there is an actual audience, it might be a different story. It's like, you know, there's a room full of people who are waiting to hear what you have to read. I've never felt that way, but
I just think context might be important. Do you know what I'm saying? I love the idea of, you know, you're just writing. It sounds like you're both just, at some point you're just writing. But again, like I think once you understand, or when or if one situates himself inside of a context that only particular kinds of people are literally being written to, and we can blame publishing if we want, but I think we can blame our imaginations. I think we might have more, well, some people might have more of a responsibility to actually broaden the scope of who they literally might be writing to. And I'll say this for another reason. I think we talk about voice a lot of times. I was talking about this with Bill Chang down in New Orleans without talking about the receiver. So if I'm whispering to like all 50 people in this room, the voice I use to whisper to them is going to be different based on the race, their clothes, their gender, things like that, right? So if I don't imagine, for me personally, if I write to whom I think the American literary national enterprise wants me to write to, I think I'm doing a disservice to people like myself as a younger me who necessarily were not ever written to. And so again, I mean, this might get into this conversation about what's political and what's not, but I just think the stakes are too high to not consider audience. I think the stakes are too high to not consider what happens to your imagination if you literally put someone else of a different gender, sexuality, race on the front row of your audience. I think something happens. And I think that it's interesting that as writers, we really don't want to, I don't want to deal with it, but I think we don't want to deal with what might happen because it could fuck up our art. But I think the stakes are too high for us to like value our like, you know, precious art over like a larger artistic loving project. That sounds really like soapboxish, but I actually mean everything I'm saying, so I don't know.
Have you written things or have you read pieces that either after they were published and out in the world, say that in your own case or something else that you've read that you thought was kind of a missed opportunity for this reason, like it should have been shaped, addressed to a particular audience and would have been a better piece, a better poem, better piece of fiction if it had been? I realize it's really hypothetical, but but I'm just curious, the way that you were talking about that made me think of this like possible missed opportunity if you're not keeping those things in mind.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I mean, I just want to be clear about what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, like, as a writer, it's like, if we look at every sentence as an opportunity, like my career as a writer is filled with missed opportunities to do exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying that everything is encouraging me not to do what I'm saying. So, I mean, we could look at the shit I wrote for Guernica, you could look at my novels, like, they're sentences, they're paragraphs where the urge to be literary, American literary, I think run up against the urge to be truthful, dynamic, and wonderfully Southern and Black. And so I think my life as a writer is filled with missed opportunities. Because I think that urge is so big that some people don't even have to consider it. So, and publishing is so white that you definitely don't have to consider it.
I don't know, I wonder, I mean, and I haven't really talked to you at length about this, but this makes me wonder, you know, if, you know, the moments where you capture a character in the most authentic way, when they are, you know, the most, you know, wonderful Southern Black character that you want to represent, isn't those moments when you have forgotten audience? Like, I have a really hard time believing that you can have an agenda and really represent a character the way that that character should be represented, or the way that's most authentic. Because we always put on so many different faces, depending on who's there. I mean, like you were saying, like, depending on who's watching me, I'm a different Dina every single time. But, you know, the most authentic me and all of every character is when they're completely, you know, alone and not thinking. So why wouldn't that be a way to, you know, reconcile those two?
Well, because what I'm saying is, I think that is a way you reconcile it.
Mm-hmm.
But I just think you have like a trust for human nature that I just don't have, right? I think if left to our own devices, we're going to be incredibly sexist, incredibly homophobic, incredibly racist. And so this ocean of like this pure moment where we can just be us, I'm saying we better push back against that shit, because everything in culture encourages me to be a fucked up person. And so if I know that, I understand that I need to revise myself into compassion, into care, into a particular kind of wonder that I think often runs antithetical to the American literary enterprise. But I hear you don't.
Yeah.
But I do.
But that doesn't necessarily mean I don't.
Oh, I thought you were saying I don't.
Are you still writing for yourself, though? Is the younger part of yourself that needed that story?
Absolutely. I mean, when I say young Black boys and girls from Mississippi, I mean, that's me, that's my grandmother, that's...
Yeah, and you're, one of the Guernica stories is a dialogue with your mother.
Right.
And family and the obligations and so forth. That
Right.
is at play, as does the story, the lesson.
Right.
I was just wondering if that...
Yeah, I mean, and
all plays
that
into it.
dialogue is my mother saying, don't give these people stuff they don't deserve, right? Like, she's
Yeah.
saying, don't be as whatever as I think I might
Yeah,
need
yeah.
to be. So, yeah.
I just wondered, you must have run into the phenomenon that Dina describes, where like all the Iranians are upset about the way you depict them, and it's kind of the shared experience, right? I
Well,
wonder,
I
like,
know
Casey,
what's-
you must have
yeah.
had the same experience too, right?
I mean, I just think it's a different context, because I think the people that I'm writing to and for know that there would be no American language, idiom, music, rhythm without us. So it's never like, you did us wrong, you know? It's just like, I wish there were more people doing it like you, truth be told.
So you've never had anyone like get really upset by a short
I
story?
had my
written or
mom
a
that get
poem?
mad because I put some shit out that they might not. You know what I'm saying? I've never had somebody be like, you played us because you depicted the South in this particular way, you depicted this particular whatever in a way that wasn't No, I haven't, but I'm sure I will. I don't know, maybe you should talk about other stuff.
Well, people always,
I was just curious.
people always have a problem with the way that you depict things, but you know, I feel like the thing that I got from a lot of Iranians wasn't even about depiction. It was about the very right to even put pen to paper on that subject, you
But
know?
when they confronted with you
Yeah.
with that, had they read it?
Some of them had, some hadn't, but there was one particular person that I spoke to who felt very, very strongly that I shouldn't have written this, and he had read the book. And we had a long discussion about this, and I said, well, tell me, did I get anything wrong? What, I mean, I did so much research, I did years of research, and so tell me what I got wrong. And he said, no, you didn't get anything wrong, and that makes it worse. You know? And I couldn't really get my head around that, but what he was saying is that, you know, if you had gotten it wrong, the world would have called you on it immediately. But you didn't, and so now you've put yourself in a position of being justified. Like now you can write, you know, about Iran, and you shouldn't, because there's somebody else who's really suffered. Do you know? And that person should get the chance. Although, and I feel like that's terribly misguided, because everyone has a story and there's room for everyone's stories. Everyone has many stories and there's room for all of those too. But I think the idea of the right, you know, to write about something in particular, it goes against everything that art and fiction is about. And maybe I'm being idealistic.
So he's saying that suffering makes the story more valid?
No, I'm saying he thinks that the Iranian experience belongs to people who have suffered for it.
And therefore
Yeah,
it's more
yeah,
valid?
therefore
Yeah,
it's more valid.
exactly. So the name on the cover matters, I suppose.
I mean,
But no, also the biography of the biography of the author. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just want to say, just to answer the question, what I have had people say to me, and this, when you said that, I thought about it, and I actually think this criticism is valid, is that, you know, if you're going to make a living, make a writing life, writing to and for the South, at some point, you better move back. You know what I'm saying? Like, you as a writer and teacher better come back home and actually, like, situate yourself there. You can't, ethically, I've heard people say to me, and I think they're right, what does it mean for you to be up at Vassar teaching, doing all this, that, and the third, and not situating yourself in this place that is like giving you writerly legs? And I mean, and I have no response to that, because I think that that's true.
Well, I don't know, I
For me,
completely,
personally.
no, but I have to disagree with that, because I feel like that kind of thinking is like the, you know, overbearing mother who says, you owe me, you owe me, you owe me for the rest of your freaking life, you know? Like, I feel like the real way to nurture something, whether it be your child, or whether it be art, or an artist or something, is to let it go so that it can actually, you know, like grow into what it needs to be. I feel like it's very, very stifling to have people say that you should be living a certain way, you should be writing a certain way, you should be doing anything except being absolutely true to what, you know, you want to say to the world. And I think that's the only obligation. I get really, really upset when there are other obligations added to the list, and I can see you feel a sense of duty, you know? And maybe because I've wandered the world, I feel no sense of duty to anything except the actual art, you know? And that sounds so hoity-toity. It sounds so
I wanted to hear how it sounded. How it sounded? It sounded hoity-toity.
It sounds like, you know, it's not good.
It just sounds the way it's supposed to be, but I'm just saying that the way it's supposed to be isn't so great.
What do you mean?
I mean, we're supposed to, like, just fucking write and not care. This is what writers do.
No, not care. Care about just one thing, and that's being true and honest, you know, like to the experience of whatever character you're writing about and to the art. But no obligations to people just because they nurtured you. No obligations to people because they have political agenda.
I definitely hear you.
No, I mean, you're supposed to be.
I so hear you. I
Yeah.
so hear you. I hear you.
I love the wincing when I said no obligations to people who nurtured you.
I mean-
I meant in the work. Like, you should still visit them on the
Right, I got you.
because this is being videotaped, I feel the
It's too late now.
it's too late for so much stuff.
Right.
Should we open up to questions? Are there questions? All right. Yeah, my hand go first, okay.
Okay, so, particularly in reference to this last bit of conversation, I think this is a great question. I think I know what your answer is going to be, but everybody else, I'm going to think about. Do you think there's a level of privilege attached to the act of just being able to write for writing's sake? Think about it. Do not answer.
Yes, I think there is a level of privilege. But, you know, again, this is going to sound like ridiculously idealistic, but one of the great things about writing is that all it takes is like a piece of paper and a pencil. Yes, you need an actual, the material circumstances in which to write. You need the mind that has been trained the way writers train themselves, often train themselves. I mean, we have these wonderful like educational systems now, but you know, writers for most of the history of this practice have trained themselves. You need a set of material circumstances. You need a sense of self that's strong enough to tell you that you can speak for someone other than yourself, and maybe a lot of people won't feel that way. But I guess I am weirdly idealistic about it. You know, I think people write everywhere for whatever the private reasons are, and they're often writing in opposition to something, to whatever has power over them. This is so I think a dire set of circumstances from the outside can often be like a wonderfully productive set of circumstances for the writer. I mean, horrible for the writer's life and the people for the people around the writer. You know, I mean, I was just reading a story today in the Moscow Times about what's happening in Putin's Russia now. And there's all this incredible pressure on artists, you know, playwrights, fiction writers, poets. Like if you write something that's critical of any part of the government, you know, you are subject to, you know, like Pussy Riot. You know, you can be put in jail, you can be beaten, you can be assassinated. I mean, this is a universal story. It happens all the time, all over the world. So to be honest, no, I don't think it takes a kind of privilege to write. I mean, yes, you need the material circumstances which should do it.
Which are informed by privilege, are they not? Like,
sure, but think of all the writers through time who've had no privilege, you know, or who have fought and scraped to get whatever privilege they can attain for themselves in order to write.
But what are we supposed to think? So we think about it. I want to think about it.
Yeah.
And then what are we supposed to think about it? What's the next part of that? So I thought about them. Then what do we do?
You mean?
So you said think about them. So I thought about them. Then so what's the next part of that exercise?
After we think about what they've done?
Yeah, no, you just said think about all the writers who've like, you know, somehow like gone beyond not having privilege, and so I'm saying there has to be more to that statement than just think about
the story of the writer in society, the writer in life is often very sad. I mean, I'm teaching Nella Larson now in a course of mine, a Harlem Renaissance writer, who had one of the saddest lives of any writer I've ever sort of heard of. She came from mixed parentage, which meant that she didn't fit necessarily in Harlem. Like she had to keep the fact that she had a white mother's secret. Although she had, you know, for quite a while, she had a husband who was, you know, not one of the first black physicists in the United States, and she could travel very freely in that world. But she didn't fit in because of the fact that she had a white mother. And she also didn't fit into the white world. She certainly didn't fit into the publishing world. As a matter of fact, she was accused of plagiarism for a short story and essentially never published again. And she published 2 novels, Quicksand and Passing, which were published, you know, by Knopf, big houses. They did well. And then after that, she kind of lived a quiet life. She was a nurse. She was divorced. She wrote 3 novels that have disappeared. They're lost. So I don't think privilege guarantees you anything as a writer.
Absolutely. But can I say, I don't know if that was the question, but can I just answer part of the question? Because I think even when you describe the education, I don't know if we have a great educational system for like a large majority of the people in this country.
Sure.
I would argue that the educational system is like the epitome of why we're so fucked up, and a large part of the educational system is writing people out of the narrative. Right? People are using writing to write kids out of the narrative in educational system. I was written out of the narrative in the educational system, but I was privileged enough to have a mother who was a professor who believed in books. So like that was a privilege. So I want to say I think privilege is super critical. I'm not here in front of y'all if I didn't have a mother who like beat me if I didn't read it, right? That in some strange way was a privilege, and so I just think as writers, right, we get pat on the back if we make it, blah, blah. I don't know what it means for a writer to be like, I don't believe in privilege, like,
Well, I mean,
privilege
you
is
can't
real.
not, in the
Privilege
lives that we live, you can't deny the existence of it. I mean, at almost everything we do, is the fact that we're sitting here having this like very academic and philosophical discussion instead of like plowing field right now is a privilege. You know, my mom would say every time I would complain and get sad like all writers do, she would say, you know, just go through your day and take every single thing that you do and think of like your father's village in Iran and how many times your grandmother would roll her eyes at you for doing that. So there was like my morning cappuccino, there was the like taking the laundry down to somebody else to do, there was the sitting there musing with my friends and like thinking about things and writing down words instead of being actually productive, you know. So yeah, everything, I mean, the fact that we can engage in this in any kind of creative work, in art, and any kind of work that's not necessary to like the most basic survival of the world is a privilege.
Can I interject and say, I think that we might want to draw a distinction between publishing, being a published writer and being a writer, because I don't think that, I think that art creation is something that people are compelled to do regardless of their class privileges, race, whatever. But certain people have the privilege to be published, and I'm interested in sort of if that might push this conversation beyond a kind of ranking of privileges, and instead sort of ask us to think about the publishing world as producing a kind of ranking privilege that doesn't acknowledge certain types of writer or writers.
I mean, I think there is a certain privilege that comes with publishing. But I would say that, you know, one of the real heartening changes, we're all supposed to sort of be wringing our hands about the state of publishing all the time, you know, but I think the sort of collapse of the traditional sort of print power structures has been really helpful in a lot of ways. You know, it's like the Common didn't exist when I came to New York. Guernica didn't exist. I mean, you guys could start a magazine because you knew somebody who knew some coding, right?
Well, our budget was like $100 for 8 years, right? $100 a year, something like 200 tops.
I mean, I feel like there are so many more venues in which to publish your work now than there were when I started writing. It's kind of mind-boggling, and there's so many different ways to reach readers and so many different ways to be read. So I feel like there's been a really healthy kind of spreading out of authority and spreading out of power. So there aren't like 5 publishing houses that are deciding who, or 3 magazines that are deciding who gets read anymore. If you want to get read, you will find a way to be read. And even if it's just there's a shaking in the head over here. Even if it's just, you know, like getting putting up stuff on a blog using WordPress. And then you get people to read your blog, and the next thing you know, like, somebody important links to you, and you've got like 10,000 people reading your blog one day. Like, it happens. So yes, there's still a publishing power structure in place for sure, but I think it's much more freer now than it certainly was when I started writing.
Do you have a comment?
Yeah, it's a sort of related question. This conversation got me, for me, there were a series of kind of aha moments. So it's been a really great discussion for that reason, because when I write fiction, I don't think about an audience. I just want to tell a story. When I write essays, I think about my audience. And so I'm like, am I really self-involved with fiction? You know? But as a writer, you don't have to get published, but it's really great if you do, because you connect with people that way. You get your story out there, you know? And so if you don't think about the audience, then you can write things that people don't get, or they don't want to hear and they turn off. And then if you want to publish that kind of thing, there's a tension between writing that kind of thing and a temptation to tone it down a little bit so that people will actually pay attention to it. Can you comment on that?
I don't, oh, sorry.
This is not, I don't know if it's one thing that occurs to me is the distinction between a reader and an audience, is that somehow thinking about an audience is so global, it's like, and it seems a little bit commercial, or in a way, like who's actually going to be buying and reading and making decisions about this stuff. But I think at various points in crafting pieces of writing, you have to think about the reader, because you're providing an experience for the reader, and you want to create a certain kind of experience for the reader, and you don't want the reader to always have to work really hard, for example. And this is, partially speaking as an editor also, is that, I'm the first reader for a lot of pieces, and sometimes I wish the writer thought more about me before sending that piece off, because I am struggling. And so I think that, there are ways that writers have to think about readers, because it's a communicative enterprise. It doesn't have to be, you can write anything you want, but there are certain ways that, you think about the craft or the piece of writing for
It does
readers.
seem inevitable that someone is thinking about the audience at some point, because the gatekeeper, an editor, publisher, or somebody, they're going to be thinking about the audience, or whatever their mission is, or one thing or another. And I don't know what you guys
Well,
think about that.
I think that there's a big difference between thinking of an audience when you're in terms of craft, in terms of like becoming a better writer, versus thinking of an audience in terms of a message. I feel like having a message, having an agenda, almost immediately kind of destroys the ability to connect or to write fiction that's really truthful, or that's not hitting you over the head like a sledgehammer. That actually really does more successfully get whatever message across, but it's not its first aim. Its first aim is great storytelling and to share an experience and a character. And I feel like so when you think about your audience in the later parts, when you've done all of the craft work, I feel like there's a danger in that. But I feel like if you thinking about an audience in terms of getting the writing to to be good is a whole different thing. Of course, you have to do that. But I also want to comment on the idea that publishing should be any kind of a goal that changes the way you write. You could be published at one of the top 5 publishers and not get read by almost anyone. And I feel like I had this teacher who said great work gets read, no matter how much you try not to have it read. Because what ends up happening is if you work on the writing, and if you get it to be better and better and better, you're going to crave the company of other people who write that well, and you're going to go searching for that, and then you're going to know people who have great taste who will read your work. And then those people will pass it on. I mean, it might take a lot longer, but I do believe that good work will get read, and that the idea of publishing very quickly or soon will destroy the integrity of your work in the process. And also, publishing, even at the big, won't help you make a real living from it anyway. So what's the point?
So I've got a question. When you're talking about the difference between writing what you know and writing to a specific audience, and then you possibly getting labeled as you're an outsider, you have no business writing what you're doing. Anything from like sci-fi or fantasy to something like Memoirs of a Geisha, when that came out, there were a lot of critics who said, this guy doesn't have the right to write about these old Japanese traditions, right? Some American writer researching historical texts. So now, does he owe something to Japanese culture? Does he have to move there? Does he have to tithe or something like that? Because he's writing about something clearly he has no personal experience with whatsoever. He admitted that. It was all based on history. So does that take away from that book as a fiction?
I mean, I think that
This guy has a response. Yeah, you go.
but it comes back to that same question that people were talking earlier about the right to write, but that has to be placed in the context of people of privilege telling stories for other people, right? So, yeah, he could write that, but it's in the greater context of like colonization of stories that's been happening for generations. You know, so yeah, it's like an individual story. He can say whatever he wants, and that's fine. But we have to talk about the larger context in which that exists.
But my question was like, does he have the right to, like, would you say, like he should just focus on his own personal experiences and he should avoid that?
Oh, what I say?
Yeah.
Oh, no, I'm not gonna say that. I'm gonna say what? I'm gonna say that.
You know, I think that I would say that the bar is so much higher for him to get it really, really right. I feel like then he opens himself up to the scrutiny of, you know, if you do it worse than someone who was authentically there could do it, then you haven't done a good job, you haven't earned that right. I think a good example, I mean, I'm gonna go ahead and go there, but I think the help, you know, was horrible because for this very reason, because like she didn't do as good a job as someone who had actually lived the experience of like, you know, Black maid in the 60s would have done, and she made some egregious, like presumptuous choices, and you know, because why, she has a right to write? That's where my whole you have a right thing stops, you know, because I don't think she did it as well as it should have been done. And because it was such a huge book, it closes the door for somebody else to have written that book, you know.
I'm thinking that Linda's going to want us to wrap up. One more question?
Yeah. I'll ask the question. I love this vein, and actually I could argue that you have more permission being on the outside to be creative, right? But, you know, earning the right and doing the research, because I could argue Shakespeare probably didn't live in the royal court, right? There's debates about who he is. But is there a story that is not, I'm curious of all the writers, is there a story that maybe you quote unquote don't have the right to write that you want to write? Like that isn't based on deeply rooted personal heritage and experience. It's a human truth that you want to write about.
I always want to write other people's stories. I mean, because I want to know what it's like to be them.
But is there a story that like is inside you right now that you've been thinking about?
Sure, but I'm not going to tell you what they are. Maybe somebody else will.
I mean, again, I just want to say, I'm not sure I buy into this right thing first. I just want to say.
I agree.
Yeah, okay.
I feel like you should be able to write what
Yeah, I feel like people should write what they want, but I feel like they should be thoughtful, responsible, compassionate. I think those should precede whatever. But yeah, like, you know, every night I think of some story I want to write that I don't, like, I really want to write. Last night I was talking to the troubleshooter at Vassar College, and I was like, fuck, like, this dude probably has some stories to tell, right? This dude, he was coming, he stopped me, and he was just like, I got an idea, and he was just like, billionaire Black man paying these assassins to go around and kill cops who kill Black people. He came to me. I'm saying, he was like, well, you want to write that? and so while his story wasn't interesting, like, while his premise wasn't that interesting, like the story of a guy who like is a troubleshooter, he's going around fixing problems, pitching like this idea, like I would love to write. I would love to write that guy's story. But again, I don't know how I would. The question is, how in terms of language and the crafting of sentences, how would we craft the sentences on a page from that person's perspective? Like that's the question I was thinking about last night. How would I tell this story on a sentence level, in a way that was believable?
Well, let me tell you, because I talked to a troubleshooter about 3 months ago. They gave me the same idea. I've been working on the novel for 75 pages into that. No, I do think I do think most writers kind of step out of their own experience quite warily, and with exercising a lot of conscience. And it can be sort of crippling. I do know there have been projects that I've started and not finished for reasons like that. My second novel had a major character who was Black, and I got some flack for writing a Black character at that time. So I think I don't know, I think we all do it warily and we do it carefully. But sometimes there's some animating idea, like you say, that's kind of stronger than whatever the limitations we feel like might be on what's possible.
I feel like for me, the right to write about someone, I feel like if I am willing to, I'm passionate enough about a topic or a character to want to get, just crawl into their body and live their life and you know, research everything and do it well, then that gives me the right. So there's nothing that I want that much that I wouldn't do. So those two things are kind of the same thing to me. If I don't have the right, that means I don't want to, so I don't want to enough. So there's no conflict there.
I mean, the real problem is that ultimately, like other people is what's interesting in the world, right? I mean, unlike Nabokov's quote, this idea of like these people, you know, everyone wearing his mask, to me that's a nightmare. That's like hell, you know, reading to a room full of people who are wearing your mask. I mean, like it's other people and their experience that's interesting. So the idea that you're somehow limited to your own experience is just like, what a shame.
Imprisoning. Sure. Why don't you ask her last question?
Okay, thank you. It's more of a parlay with what Ben was just saying about the Nabokov quote, because I've been thinking about that and two other things that came up earlier in the evening. And to me, that Nabokov quote says something entirely different, and it's got more to do with the self we put in the world, and that those selves are masked. And to what extent we take those masks into our private chamber where we write as well. And so to have Nabokov writing to a room full of people wearing his own mask, that means he's relating to people who share a sense of maskedness, not even necessarily literally the same surface details, but a sense of needing to mask an inner self. And then linking that with the Virginia Woolf and this idea of summoning these invisible presences, that it's whether it's parts of our own past or parts of our cultural heritage or just parts of our inner self that are the things that compel us to write. And then I want to go back to Kiese's idea of the difference between writing for and writing to. And I feel like with the Nabokov, what he's talking about with the mask is that's who he's writing for. And that's an entirely legitimate enterprise and part of what makes Nabokov so good. But that's not enough. You can't just write to the mask and to the parts of ourselves that we need to hide, because that's as much a part of, you know, what we're writing about is what we need to hide as well as what we need to expose. But then it's that transcendence or that authentic self that is the hardest to reveal in writing, I think, and that's the two. And there's partly an arbitrariness to that, I think, and partly something deeper that we're always striving towards. And that can transcend circumstance, that can transcend race, but if it's going to do so, it does so by originating oneself still in the truth of one's own experience, however that needs to be expressed. So like Kiese writing about his experiences, I had the pleasure of hearing Kiese read, I think it was last week, and felt like there was something, he wasn't writing for me, I knew that, or I felt that it wasn't meant for me, I wasn't an intended audience. I shared some understanding of some of the circumstances within what was being read, but whatever was in there spoke to me, and that was because of the writing, it wasn't because of me, if that makes any sense. So it feels like all these things have been sewn up in this discussion, and it's that idea of that interplay between the outside room and the inside, and how hard it is to parlay that communication, but that's the continuous effort with the writing. I'm sorry, I'm going to the writing.
That was like the
Very well
concluding
stated.
chapter to the whole.
Yeah, we're done.